It's time again for another Saving Seeds 101 episode, and I'm going to pick brassicas, that huge taxonomic catch-all of garden vegetables that at first appearance don't have a lot in common with one another because of the various different things that you get back from them. As you can see behind me, a few of our brassicas are actually in flower, and I think we're going to keep this one a little higher level because you can go down the proverbial rabbit hole pretty far. The one theme you're going to notice, where possible, you're better with less variety if you're actually planning to save seeds. You can make it work if you know a little bit more about the particular variety and species that you're planning to work with. So let's go take a look at this and discuss it a little further. Well, the brassicas are a fairly familiar group. They include an awful lot of very familiar garden vegetables, from kale to broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, hence the other name, the cabbage family, cauliflower, turnips, radishes, mustards, and there's more. Pretty diverse. This here is our red Russian kale, which you can see is already gone pretty gung-ho on the going to flower. So the one saving grace with brassicas is most of them are very prolific seed producers, which is a benefit. That makes at least one part of the aspect of doing seed saving with brassicas a little bit easier. The downside is, to put it very bluntly, they have a pretty large separation distance, and that separation distance is pretty much across the board, with some exceptions, but 1.6 kilometers. So that's pretty far. Where this gets interesting is it really depends on the species, and there are several different species of brassicas. Knowing which variety of brassica you're dealing with and what species it belongs to is important. The first and probably biggest group of brassicas that most of us are familiar with belong to the species Brassica oleracea, and I'm probably going to butcher some of these scientific names, just putting that out there. B. oleracea contains some of the most familiar brassicas. Cabbage, such as this drumhead cabbage behind me that's going to flower, is in that species. Broccoli, cauliflower, most of the kales, and there are others. If you're growing these various things, you need to keep them pretty far away from each other if you're going to have them all go to seed at the same time, because 1.6 kilometers is a big distance. The nice part of it is, not a lot of people do save seeds from brassicas. I don't think it's necessarily difficult, it's more the planning aspect that makes it sort of intermediate. Some varieties of this species are biannuals, such as, again, these drumhead cabbages behind me. Others are annuals, such as broccoli and cauliflower. So they will go to seed in their first year. This is where timing comes in to play, and is kind of a central theme all the way along here. Timing can mean a lot of different things. So timing could be two biannuals, so just two kinds of cabbage that you really, really liked and wanted to keep. Timing could be as simple as letting one go to seed one year and one go to seed the next, so that essentially you never have both varieties going to seed at the same time. It can get more complicated because you could throw an annual in there and do the same thing. Have, for example, our drumhead cabbage go to seed now, this year, 2021, and say broccoli go to seed in 2022. That's a complete possibility too. But you can see how there's a bit of planning required to do that, basically. You can also get a little more complicated with it and potentially have, say, a biannual, such as these cabbage, go to seed early. And what we basically did, we overwintered these outside. And although we're not experts at it, it can be done. Of course, they've gone to flower and are well into their reproductive life cycle. We also have a variety of broccoli that we'd really like to save some seeds from. So separation could be a different time frame in the same year, i.e. getting the cabbage, which is the biannual, to go to seed first, or go to flower first. Because once it's gone to flower and the seeds have started to form, it doesn't really matter anymore. And then let the broccoli go later in the year. That's the nice thing about brassicas. The family generally likes cooler weather, so depending on where you are, you can get creative with sort of spring and even fall sowing. That really is sort of the base theme here, is to do the brassicas. If you're picking varieties of the same species, it's nice to know what's an annual, what's a biannual, and also plan that out a little bit so you can separate them out with time, and time could be in the same year or in separate years. So switching gears to a different species, we have Brassica napus, which, and this is where common names, I think the Brassica family is where common names mean very little, and you really need to know, at least have access to figuring out sort of scientific names and whatnot. But these are, of course, red Russian kale, which are sort of a variety of Siberian kales. Siberian kales are not the same species as most of the sort of more typical green kales, which are, like this cabbage, Brassica oleracea. So this is a completely different species. And interestingly, and this is where brassicas get interesting as we watch this bumblebee pollinating our drumhead cabbages, is you can have plants in the same species, same botanical species, that have completely different growth habits. So Brassica napus, you don't necessarily need to keep it separate from Brassica oleracea, although I will put a disclaimer here. There have been instances throughout history of different species of Brassica crossing. I'm not going to go that far into it. I think brassicas are also one of those things that show sometimes you can only be so much of a purist when you still require insect pollination, etc. Unless you really, really, really want to restrict yourself. But you can still apply some principles to sort of maximize getting the things that you want, the kales, the cabbages, the broccolis, the turnips, etc. So, on that note, Brassica napus. Of course, the Siberian kales, like the red Russian kale behind me, are in that family, but so are rutabagas, and so are canola, and some of the oil seeds. So, again, things that don't share a lot in common physically, and to most of us. They do botanically, because they have similar flower parts and this, that, and whatever that make the classification. Rutabaga and kale, however, don't share a lot of similarities in growth habit to most of us as a vegetable when we're eating the leafy parts of one and the tuber of another. Or in large stem, I suppose is what it really is. But so another good example of knowing what you have. Another brassica that we don't actually have started yet, which is bad on us, is Brassica rapa, which Brassica rapa is the most famous one, would be turnips. Again, there are other members of this species that are common garden vegetables. Other members include like the pak choys and Chinese cabbages or Asian cabbages, bok choy, those type of things, and broccoli rapini. I'm saying that right. I've got some notes because this is a bit of a complex one. And of course, there are as well some other species in the mustards group, and some of those are, again, more than one species. But without getting into, it would be impossible in a video, in a reasonably short video, to go through every single member of the Brassica family. And I think the take-home message here, it's doable. They have crazy separation distances from one another. So within a species, you really have to be concerned with time, space and time, as far as your seed saving methods. For example, in the simplest concept, if you had one variety for each of the species, you could easily have them all go to seed at the same time. And although it's not impossible that they would cross, the likelihood is relatively low. And I think that's, I've said it before, but that's something about plants. All you're able to do is really reduce the risk. Plants have this uncanny way of wanting to outcross. So some may say, well, why does that matter? Well, it does if you want to, the members of the Brassica, cabbage is very different from turnip, which is very different from broccoli, from a cauliflower, etc. And I know those are different species, but they all have very, very different food values. And it's that food value that makes them important. And as we saw with the carrots, if you don't select for it, you often lose whatever it is that we've selected for over time. Another note about the brassicas, in a very general statement, is typically they don't, as I'm looking at some of these seedling red Russian kales and some of our other various brassica seedlings that we have on the go, they don't respond well to inbreeding depression. What I mean by that is they're kind of the exact opposite of tomatoes. Obviously tomatoes, you could save seeds, viable seeds, and propagate an entire life's worth of tomatoes from that one seed. That doesn't work super well with brassicas, and this kind of goes back to what I mentioned about them wanting to outcross. Ideally they want to outcross with something in their species. So if you're growing, for example, something like these broccolis, you want to let multiple individuals go to seed, and that does vary a bit. A lot of resources will tell you from like somewhere as low as maybe 5 up to, could be up to 20 individuals. Now that's not always going to be feasible, but it is something to consider, as you saw from our beds of flowering red Russian kale and drumhead cabbage. We've got multiples, and those individual plants have lots of seeds, which again goes back to the timing thing. So somewhat on that note, brassicas are relatively good to deal with because they do have a bit of a longer seed viability than some varieties of vegetables, which we haven't got to yet, that have really low seed viability in terms of storage years. But on average, you'll get really good results even up to 5 years after they've gone to flower, which is another good thing, because if you do want to stagger your seed production as a secondary crop, or I guess it's really a pretty important secondary crop, but you can do that over much longer periods of time, i.e. basically same thing. Don't try to get them all to go to seed in the same year, or you will end up with a bit of a brassica mess. But that is something to consider. Like when we look at the number of drumhead cabbages, for example, that we have going to seed, we're going to have a lot of seed produced from them. They'll produce a ton of seed. So do we really need drumhead cabbages to go to seed for the next couple of years? Probably not. So if we wanted to try some experimenting with some other members of the Brassica oleracea family, we kind of have that opportunity, as long as we get a good seed crop this year. So that's a very brief overview of the brassicas, and mostly just because it's the same story over and over again between the species. It's just knowing whatever vegetable you're growing, what species it belongs to, figuring out whether it's an annual or biannual, and then limiting the number of varieties, well, to one, of any given species that go to flower at the same time. And that's really your key to success with saving brassica seeds. Within that group, there's all sorts of things to think about as far as selection. I mean, for something like kale, it's a little simpler. It's a pretty simple plant. You're eating the leaf. Not a lot of special qualities, for lack of a better way to put it. Now you could look at things like color. I mean, the red Russian kale, as you can see, has some nice color to it, so you may go through and make your selection process on that. Some of the other members of the family, turnips for example, you're obviously going to want to let some of your best examples of your turnip roots go to seed over some of the less desirable ones. And that actually brings me to a group of brassicas I haven't talked about yet, which on that selection process is probably the paramount thing you need to consider. And I'm going to look down because I'm going to get this scientific name wrong. Raphanus sativus, which is the radishes. Radishes are members of the Brassica family, but they are in a totally different genus than a lot of the brassicas. As you saw, a lot of them were Brassica oleracea, Brassica napus, etc. radishes are less related, and they're annuals, which is fantastic, and they have a tendency to want to go to seed. But the big thing with radishes, probably above all the rest of the Brassica family, is you don't want to save seeds from a radish that has gone to flower, bolted, and not grown a tuber, because you will over time end up with radishes that don't produce tubers, if that's what you're hoping to get from them. So they exemplify the selection process the best. Really, it applies to all of them. Kohlrabi, broccoli, sky's the limit here. So brassicas are kind of one of those longer term vegetables, partially because a lot of them are biannuals, but also because they tend to be something that, if you have a good environment to grow them, you want to grow multiple different varieties for their various botanical oddities that make them great vegetables, i.e. Brussels sprouts. They just take some thought, and that's really what makes them hard. The plants themselves are very willing to go to seed. You do have to apply a bit of selection, i.e. if you can help it, don't save seeds from plants that are bolting, i.e. the radishes. They won't necessarily produce you the best quality seed for replanting in the future. And you just need to give some consideration for what you want to go to seed when, and then have the space to let multiple individuals go at the same time. And that's really kind of it, without getting into the nitty-gritty of individual types. So on that note, it's well into gardening season, and I should get going on a few things, but there will be we may touch on brassicas again, just because why not? But that's kind of an overview.